Hello, welcome to Tuesday, which is day 2 of our brand new unit, trig graphing. Yesterday we learned some different vocabulary. Today we're going to see how that works when we are graphing sine and cosine. So before you get started, I need you to actually pause this video and find your unit circle summary sheet. You will need that to do all of our notes today. So pause, go find your unit circle summary sheet. Alright, now that you have your unit circle summary sheet in front of you, I'm going to ask you to fill out this table for sine. And if you recall, when looking at your unit circle summary sheet, the coordinates are cosine, comma, sine. So I'm looking for the y coordinate for all of these different radian measures. So I got this table started from you. All my y coordinates at 0 radians, my y coordinate is 0. At pi over 6 radians, my y coordinate is 1/2. And then continuing all the way around my circle, so if I went to 2 pi over 3, my y coordinate would be root 3 over 2. Can you pause this video and fill out the rest of your table? So look for where 3 pi over 4 radians are, and then write down the y coordinate, and continue and finish this top table. Alright, once you have that filled out, now underneath it, I'm going to ask you to write down the different decimal approximations, and I actually already typed it into the calculator for you. So, as you can see, 1/2, same as 0.5, root 2 over 2 is about 0.71, root 3 over 2 is 0.87, and then if I continue, 1 is 1, root 3 over 2, I already did that for you right there. So I know that this is about 0.87, root 2 over 2, I did that for you there. 0.71, 1/2 is 0.5, and I want you to continue through that table. You'll see that it's the same decimals, just don't forget if you have negative signs. Then negative root 2 over 2 is negative 0.71. Go ahead and pause the video and continue to fill that out. Alright, so now that we have this table filled out, we have the exact form we wrote on the top, and then we wrote the approximate underneath it. The reason I did that, it'll be a little bit easier for us to go and graph. So since all of these numbers in our table were for sine, we're actually going to be able to graph the sine graph with these numbers. And I started it off for you. So let me zoom in. 0, 0, pi over 6, we were at 1/2. Pi over 4, we were up at 0.71. And then the next dot, so I plotted the first 5 dots for you. The next dot is at 2 pi over 3. Well, 2 pi over 3 we said was about 0.87. So let's go up to 0.87. Our next tick mark is 3 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4. Okay, now 5 pi over 6 is at 1/2. And then pi is at 0. And this looks nice and symmetric. One way to check your work. As I continue going, 7 pi over 6 was at negative 0.5. And then 5 pi over 4 was at negative 0.71. So can you pause this video, see if you can fill out the rest of this graph, plot those points. It should look symmetrical, just like the left side, but this time we are down below that x-axis. See if you can plot those points. Alright, see if your points look about how mine do. Again, we don't have all those grid lines, but it should look like a similar shape. And if I connect these dots to really show what shape we're making, I have this nice curved line. every single sine graph is going to have this same exact behavior. And let's put some of the vocab that we learned yesterday and apply it to this graph here. So let's see, the maximum is the very highest that your graph will go. The minimum is the lowest point on your graph. The period is the length of one cycle. And what you see here is one sine cycle. So from 0 all the way to 2 pi, that is one period. And one period is 2 pi. And how we know where we are going to start and stop that cycle, every single sine graph will always start on the midline, and we'll label that in a moment. So sine will start at midline. And visually what that will look like, if you have your midline, you will start at your midline and look like that. So let's go back to this graph and label our midline. The midline is the middle. And now when we are going to start graphing sine and cosine, we are going to use 5 critical points, because it would be super annoying if we had to make this whole giant table for every single problem. The points that we are going to use are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And if you look at your unit circle where those points actually come from, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. So we're going to use those quadrantals, and those are the 5 critical values we will use. And if you notice on our graph, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So those 5 points are going to be the only points that we will need when graphing sine. And you will see the first, middle, and last are always on the midline. And then the 2 in between will be your maximum and your minimum. So this is the general behavior for sine. So just putting some of the vocab to this new graph that we have seen. The last vocab word that we have not yet labeled, and we can go draw that in, is the amplitude. Amplitude is the distance from the midline to max, mid to max. Amplitude. Okay, now I believe we have labeled all of that new vocab that we got yesterday. So now let's go on and let's do the same exact thing for cosine. All right, get your unit circle back out in front of you. This time when we're filling in our table, we are doing cosine, which are the x-coordinates. So at 0, my x-coordinate is 1. At pi over 6, my x-coordinate is root 3 over 2. At pi over 4, my x-coordinate is root 2 over 2. Go ahead and pause this video and fill in the rest of your table. Alright, now that we have those filled in, it's going to be a lot easier to graph this if I knew what those decimal approximations were. So go ahead and look on the work that you did for sine at what those decimals are, and let's just write that underneath the table. So 1 is 1. I know root 3 over 2 is about 0.87. Root 2 over 2 is 0.71. 1/2 is 0.5. 0, negative 0.5. And go ahead and continue just under the table. Let's just write the decimal approximation. It'll make it easier when we go to graph. Alright, so in the future, when we're going to graph cosine, it's going to be just like sine, where we're only going to graph those 5 critical points, which are at 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And again, where I got those from, they are all of my quadrantals on my unit circle. So 0, pi over 2, oops, move this, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. But because we've never graphed cosine before and we're not quite sure what it will look like, just for this one time, we're going to plot every single point from our table, just like we did for sine. So when I go to plot these, let's see. At 0, cosine was 1. And you know what, how about let's make it a little bit easier on ourselves. Let's kind of get the general shape with these critical values, and then I think this will make it a little bit easier, especially on our iPads. So let's just do the critical values first. So I have 0 at pi over 2. I'm at 0. At pi, I'm at -1. At 3 pi over 2, I'm back at 0. And then at 2 pi, I'm up at 1. So that's the general shape. I don't quite see the curviness like I did in sine. But if I did go back and actually plot all of those other points, I would end up seeing this curve all the way through. And what it's going to end up looking like, a curve kind of like that. And I know it's hard to see when I'm drawing on my iPad, but I can tell you that every single time we have a cosine graph, it will look like this. Now, if I'm comparing it to my sine graph, it does look curvy, but it looks a little bit different. If I'm kind of summarizing the general shape of a cosine graph, cosine is always going to start either above or below the midline. So cosine starts above or below the midline. Above or below midline. And what that would look like, if that is my midline, starting above, or it could actually start below, and we have a nice curvy shape like that. Let's go back and label the other vocab that we did for sine. So if I am looking at my new cosine graph, the very highest point is the maximum. The lowest point is still my minimum. Let's see, I can label the midline. The midline is in the middle, here at 0. So I can see this time only these 2 points are on the midline. The first, middle, and last are either above or below. When I'm looking at the period of this graph, and the period is the length of one cycle. So from 0 all the way over to 2 pi is the period. So period is 2 pi. So it looks like I'm going from max to max to help figure out that period. And then the last thing that I can label is, from that vocab from yesterday, is the amplitude. And I can label that as mid to max or mid to min. It'll be the same thing either way. Let's see. So the distance from my midline to the max will be my amplitude. Okay, so the purpose of today and of this video was just to get out the basic behavior of a sine and cosine function. We've been using sine and cosine on our unit circle, but now actually taking those values that come around our unit circle and graphing them, we're getting these different curves.